In this video, I want to review place tracing points and place points over a path within Hilti field points. These are very similar, and I think it's worth to go over both in one video. Let's begin with place points over a path, as I believe this might be the more common thing to use. When you want to place points over a path, essentially what you're doing is you're going to select an entity, whether that be an arc, line, polyline, 3D polyline, or spline. When you select that entity, you will then be able to place points as you please along that entity, whether that's simply at the end of that entity, along the entity, offset that entity, etc. So let me show you a good example of where you might use this. In this drawing, I have some drywall track, or some arcs in general, doesn't matter, and you can see that it follows as arc right over here. If I wanted to place points along that arc in one click, very quickly, all I need to do is go to Place Points Over a Path, select the entity or this arc that I want to use. So I'll use this arc here. I'll go ahead and set my point information. So I'll use the circle. I'll set my annotation settings as normal. No description for me. Let me go ahead and give this arc point so that I know that I'm making an arc point, starting with the number 1 and no suffix. This, again, is completely to your preference. What's new, however, is everything along here. Notice it's asking you how you want to place your points along this path. Right now, I don't have it selected to place points along the path. Right now, the only thing I have selected is to place segment endpoints. So if I place segment endpoints, you'll notice that it'll simply put a point at the bottom and at the top, or at the ends of the entity. However, let's say that I want a little bit more creative than that. I do want to place it along the path. Okay, so right now I have the option of not along entity path. If I check it, you'll see that yes, I am now placing it along the entity path. And the tool is now asking me, how do you want to place those points along the entity path? Right now, I have spacing between points starting at 4 feet, and then it's asking me, do I want to change my start point offset? Meaning, when does it want to start counting the 4 feet? Is it right at the end point, which is default at 0? Or do I want to create a point somewhere offset the end point of this arc and start that spacing somewhere else? What I'm going to do to keep it simple, because you're going to experiment with this anyway, I'm going to have my offset be normal at 0, meaning I'm going to start my offset starting at the start point of the line, and it's going to offset a point every 4 feet. So to show you that, let me place that. Once you press place, you'll notice at the bottom it's asking you to select the start point. And the reason it asks you that is because it wants to know where you want to start your point numbering and where you want it to end. So right now, if I select this location, that's the start point. And let's show you what happens. Here's my start point. I press click. And all of a sudden, all the points start. You'll notice my start points here, P1, my endpoints at the top, P21, and all these points should now have a 4-foot offset along the arc. So I'll do the distance command, and let's just observe, point 1 to point 2, exactly 4 feet. And one more time, point 2 to point 3, exactly 4 feet. Now to clarify what it meant by starting point, so notice P1 is my starting point, so everything should be 4 feet all the way up to the top. Now, where it might be a little shallower or shorter is P20 to P21, because right now P21 is simply representing the end of my line. So P19 to P20 should be 4 feet. Let's just check that. Great. So P20 and P19 has a 4-foot distance between it. But let's see what it is between P20 and P21. P20 to P21 is coming up a little short of 4 feet. Why is that? Well, that's simply because P21 represents the end of the line. That's why the distance from P20 to P21 is different. And that's also why it asks you where you want the starting point to be, because the tool is still going to have to place a point at the end if you ask it to. So now that we understand that, let's review some of the other options you have here. The first one is minimum distance between points. If you have this checked, it's going to ask you, as the points approach the end of the entity, do you want to have a minimum distance requirement? I think the best way to show this is to simply give you an example. I'm going to make my minimum distance requirement 2 feet. And what you can see is that the entities are going to be placed 2 feet apart, and I only want entities that are at minimum 2 feet apart throughout the entire segment. Let me show you the implications of this. For this situation, I just used this simple arc to show you. You can notice P1 to P2, 2 feet, 2 to 3, 2 feet, 3 to 4, 2 feet, but 4 to 5 is longer than 2 feet. It's coming up as 3 foot 7 7/16. Now the reason for that is because 4 to 5, if they have a 2-foot point up here, would require that the end point from this point over here would be less than 2 feet. So the software automatically cancels making the points right here to eliminate that small distance between those 2 points. Most likely this won't be super critical to you, but that's what minimum distance means. Typically speaking, I leave that unchecked and I don't mind having small distances as it approaches the end of the arc. So I'll go ahead and uncheck the minimum distance as I almost always do by default. Now 2 more things I want to show you. First is placing points with or without an offset. If I have this checked, it's simply going to ask me my offset I would like to place on these points, and it would simply offset the points from the entity. So let's make a simple 1 foot offset. 1 foot offset, space between points 4 feet. Let me select my entity. I'll use this here, and I'll say place, and let me use the bottom of this arc as my entity. Now immediately when you click on the endpoint, it's going to ask you how you want your offset. So if you notice, I can move my mouse to the right or the left of the entity, and that is where it's going to put my 1 foot offset. So I'll go to the right side and simply press click. And you'll notice I have an exact 1 foot offset from the entity over here. Now notice it follows the arc exactly. It's a simple 1 foot offset following the trajectory of this arc. So this might be really helpful to you if you are trying to indicate points of your drywall track on a finished wall drawing, offset your piping hangers from a pipe, whether that's electrical or plumbing, etc. Now the last thing I wanted to show was that you can also do this on polylines, and you can notice that here is the polyline. Maybe it's not so practical that you put points on this object, but let me at least use this object as an example. Place points over a path. I will use this polyline as my object. I'll keep the 4 foot offset, and I'll go ahead and remove the offset distance to keep this simple. When I say place, it's going to ask me my starting point, so I'll go ahead and use this corner, and automatically you'll see it places points all around the entire object. And I believe these all should be 4 feet apart. 4 feet there, 4 feet here, and because I didn't use a minimum distance, I'll have the tail end of the points coming in at about 2'4", which is fine for me. But it will also follow polylines. And that's important, especially if you have a polyline or a spline that's linked all the way around and you want to simply follow that entire path. You can do that with place points over a path. So please try that out yourself. I wonder what your experience is. Please share your experiences in the comments. Now, similarly to placing points over a path, you also have place tracing points. The major difference between the two is that placing tracing points only follows the straight line that you're following. You can click and click and click and click over and over again to different places, but it's going to follow the straight line trajectory between those locations, placing your points. And let me give you an example. When you open up the Place Tracing Points option box, notice it doesn't ask you to select an entity. In this case, it's going to follow your click points as you go. Basically, you're creating an invisible line for it to follow. So right now I have my point being a circle. Right now I'm placing a single point. We'll go over the other options later if you need to. But right now I'm placing a single point. I'll go ahead and make this TP for tracing point and set my elevation at 0 as I almost always do. Now the other option down here when you place a tracing point is to choose your point placement. Right now my placement is at every pick point, but if you want to place intermediate points, you can indicate that when you are making your points, it's going to also make intermediate points from first click to second click based off the distance you have here. Typically speaking, when I do tracing points, I actually have this set up to be a certain distance. And in my case, let me make this 1 foot. And again, here's your minimum distance option, which has the same properties as before. So I won't go over that, but that is where the minimum distance option is for tracing points. So now I'm ready to place. I'm going to be clicking, and it's going to be placing a point at 1 foot intervals between my clicks. Let's see how this works. Here's a straight line of a drywall. I will simply click the corner. Let's go to the next corner. And it places a point at 1 foot intervals between my pick points. And you can notice this is 1 foot distance from here to here. And then here, because I have no minimum distance selected, it simply shortens down that distance. But let's continue. I notice it's still going, so I'll come down to this one here, click. This one over here, click. And I will be done by pressing enter. So all my points are placed along that trace. And notice it's straight line to straight line. Point 1 to point 2, straight line points. Point 2 to point 3, straight line points, etc. Now a good example of where you might see this is, let's say you have a finished wall, drywall drawing for instance, and I want to make points at the track line, but the track line is not visible. Well, I know that there's a 5 5/8 offset from the finish wall to the track line. So let's see if I can use tracing points to make that offset. I'll simply go to Place Tracing Points. In this case, I will go ahead and use single point with offset because I want to make an offset of my points. My offset from the center is going to be 0 feet, 5/8 inch. And I'll go ahead and make sure my spacing is a little bit shorter than 1 foot, perhaps 6 inches. Now let's start placing these. I'll go ahead and start at this finished wall and simply start clicking along my trace. And you'll notice that it's inviting me to select the side of the offset, just like we saw with points over a path. I'll come down this way to this finished wall, and then again to this side. And what you're noticing is it's making a perfect 5/8 of an inch to the side of the wall I needed to. Let me go over to a plumbing drawing where I've drawn a line down the center of a plumbing pipe. Let's see how we can use tracing points to quickly make points along this line. Let's say that I want to put double points on the left and right side of this line as anchors. So in this case, I'll use double point on this instance, and I'll make my offset 6 inches from center, so I can have 6 inches placed from both sides of this line. I'll click the line, start point to end point, and then of course it makes perfect 6-inch offsets from that line for my convenience. So I hope that seeing this will help you understand how you can apply this in your own modeling, and I really invite you to jot down your experiences and your questions in the comments.